Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's webinar. Our webinars are recorded via WebEx and will be made accessible online after the session. We're now using Cisco WebEx Event Center. If you're having trouble joining, kindly log out the session and rejoin through the link sent to you by WebEx or by entering the meeting room number 570-218-808 and password is CDISC123. May we remind attendees that your mics are muted throughout the meeting, but you can chat your thoughts to us through the chat tab. And for questions, please type them in the Q&A tab. Tonight's speaker is Professor James Batchelor, who is the Professorial Fellow of Clinical Informatics and Healthcare Innovation at the University of Southampton. He is also the Director of the Clinical Informatics Research Unit and the EDGE program, a collaborative group of NHS hospitals and research organizations working together to support and improve the research and development process through the development of the EDGE software. Professor James is also a committee member and advisor to the Republic of Ireland eHealth program, as well as being involved in the development of clinical research standards with the University of Cologne. He has worked in this area of research for over 15 years and is well known within the research community, both in the United Kingdom and overseas, for his no-nonsense and practical solutions to clinical informatics. We will now call on our speaker, Professor James Batchelor.
Hello. So hopefully, I will hope that everybody can hear me, and I'm very pleased to be able to participate in this webinar to give you some information about clinical trials in the UK and the NHS, and to talk a little bit about how we're looking at integrating care records into clinical trials. So hopefully this should be useful in some shape or form, but also possibly to give you some ideas about mistakes that we've made in the NHS over the last 15 years, so that you might not fall into those same traps that we fell into. So I'm just going to try first of all to share my screen. So hopefully you can see my screen. So as I was introduced, I'm the Director of the Clinical Informatics Research Unit at the University of Southampton, and we're based on the south coast of the United Kingdom, so about an hour away from London. And we're a large academic teaching hospital, as well as a university, obviously, with a faculty of medicine, but a very broad life sciences and health research specialty here in Southampton. And we're also working integrated across our region. So regionally, we're the Centre for Informatics across around about 15 different hospital organisations. So just a little bit about my background and the fact that I'm a bit of an academic hybrid. So I'm obviously predominantly looking at clinical informatics, but also genomic medicine and the development of genomic and stratified and personalized medicine. But the bulk of my time is really working around the clinical protocol, the interface, and why clinical staff don't like using computer systems here in the NHS, the information architecture of how we are structuring our EPRs very badly here in the NHS, but more specifically about patient-centric care. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about clinical research and the development of clinical research in the NHS, and how this is becoming more and more integrated into our electronic healthcare records. And again, talk about how we've developed a program over the last 15 years to try and bring people closer together, to share ideas and to work towards standards around how we define terminology within clinical trials. So who am I to talk about integrated platforms? So as it was introduced, I'm the Director of the EDGE program as well. So the EDGE program has been around for about 16, 17 years, and it was developed on the back of a program of work from the Department of Health in the NHS, I guess, a health service within the NHS, which is reasonably unique, and looked at how we could integrate research into that system so we could really leverage the improvement of access to clinical trials or population-based research or health technology assessment research to improve the way we treat patients and the way we run our health service, but predominantly to link researchers and patients together much more tightly. So the history of the UK Research Network looks something like this, and obviously it's disappearing into the distance, but it started in the year 2000 with the Science and Technology Report, which is really talking about how we could integrate cancer research predominantly into the health service, as we found that patients who participated in clinical trials tended to have access to newer drugs, or it was helping to speed up the access to new drugs into the cancer care programs. So the NHR Clinical Research Network was set up to basically integrate all research into our normal day-to-day practice within the NHS, so that we could gain quicker access to patients participating in trials, and it needed to put in place infrastructure to help us open up the NHS to research, which ultimately sounded reasonably simple. So when we looked at the therapeutic areas of research that the NIHR was interested in and looking at, we looked at our entire clinical research portfolio, which predominantly was cancer, but covering obviously all the other areas that we can see in front of us, and looked to try and see how we could increase the number of clinical. So starting off, the Cancer Research Network was formed in 2000, and there was basically a requirement for us to create 32 regional networks in the UK to try and establish some infrastructure and get a better understanding of what we were doing in terms of clinical trials, and to try and increase that access to clinical information and access to patient information. So it sounds pretty simple. So we were one of the first cancer research networks with these three core questions about how many trials in the region do we have, so how many projects are we running, and how many patients are we recruiting to clinical trials within our hospitals, and who is on a trial in our hospital and who's not, and how do we increase and monitor them both, which, as I said, sounds like a reasonably simple question. But what we found very quickly was a rather pickle within the NHS of information. We had information that was being held in separate databases and silos of information. We found a lot of the information was being held on bits of paper and wasn't written down or easily accessible for consolidating that information or sharing it electronically. We had all sorts of issues about different systems, different hospitals using different systems with different terminology, and lots of information about who was the owner of the information and who was responsible for undertaking certain tasks, not only administratively from the hospital, but also from the clinical care perspective, both let's say in the acute setting, but or even in a community setting where a large number of trials were also being conducted. So really the world as we found it in the NHS was a little bit like this, where we were being asked from a government perspective to increase access for patients to trials, and this was really about saving money, making our health service more efficient, about speeding the process of changing services, but it was also around an investment into the NHS from the pharmaceutical industry, who wanted to gain access to patients on clinical trials, and thus would also gain access to free, potentially some free drug into the NHS. But the structure that was created by forming the National Cancer Research Network and us as a local research network called the CSCCRN and our hospitals underneath us left us with a diagram that looks like this, where there were no systems in place where the actual clinical care delivery was happening, which I like to refer to as the weirdos in the clinical researchers. We're running around trying to split atoms or find cures or treat patients, but we're not very good at filling in lots and lots of paperwork. So we devolved a lot of that responsibility to our nursing staff. But ultimately, at the bottom of this triangle, there were very little systems for actually helping us to do our clinical jobs. And that left us a bit of a problem in terms of the information flows that needed to be flowing up to the government in relation to what was happening with trials, or to the hospitals to know what patients were participating in trials, as there was no information anywhere. So we looked to try and address this by changing our system and developing a piece of software that was really around a piece of software that was actually helping the medical staff, the nursing staff, and various actors involved in undertaking clinical trials in a more comprehensive manner, and to actually address their day-to-day issues of how to go about doing their jobs. So we found, for instance, research nurses spent a lot of time with no real clinic space and trying to undertake the work balancing on a trolley in a corridor and not having access to computers or computer systems or software to help them manage those hundreds of patients that they might be looking after. So we built a system that was really about delivering what our clinical staff needed rather than what we needed from a reimbursement of finance perspective or anything to do with the operational running of the hospital, but something specifically more for them clinically. So to provide more systems to support research at the bottom of the stack. And then as a byproduct of those systems, the reporting that we needed to provide regionally or to government would then flow as a byproduct from that clinical process, which at the time was reasonably a radical concept in terms of clinical trials in the NHS, where we had historically done everything on paper. So we've identified over the last 16 years that this model is actually very similar actually for all of our systems in hospitals. Our EPRs here in the UK and in other areas of the world have become very focused on the insurance type model, or on payer model, or about government reporting, and again, very little to do with actually patient-centric care. And we've also identified in this process that although we have an electronic patient record system, it's predominantly still the clinical staff writing on bits of paper and putting them in paper charts. So we're really looking at how now in the NHS we can change this from being more about the administrative operation of the hospital and more dedicated towards patient-centric care. So nothing I'm sure you've not heard before. So what did we do with our specific problem at the beginning? First of all, we decided that really we needed, as I said, to produce systems that were relevant to our clinical teams, and they asked for some reasonably simple things to make their lives a lot easier, things that we in IT terms hadn't considered were really important. So the nursing staff really had problems in terms of gaining access to documents. Their biggest challenge was having to carry very large amounts of documentation around, such as protocols, patient information sheets and patient consent forms. And this was taking up a lot of their time, and also running around after the doctors to provide them with various protocols for treating patients on clinical trials, or again gaining access to information that the doctor staff. So first of all, we really just wanted to build something that would mean we would have a single database of our research projects, so which projects were we actually running, as previously this was all written down on bits of paper. And associated to those research projects, we would add a load of documents as PDFs and PDF store to try and share those with the nursing staff in between the different hospitals, as we had one copy in one hospital and one copy in another hospital, and really they were both trying to get hold of the same document. So just to try and centralize that, and that list of projects then to be able to write some reports on. But as time went on over the years, we grew from one network of one group or network of hospitals collaborating around our research projects, our patients on trials, and the information that we were holding, to a broader community of people that wanted to also participate and use the system. So we became the highest recruiting research network in the country. We had much more access to clinical trials for our patients to participate on. We saw a larger amount or number of people wanting to open clinical trials within our environment, and other networks around the country wanted to know how we were achieving this. So largely a number of hospitals started to ask if they could join us and use the software and save the duplication. And it became also very evident that we were going to need more functionality as different actors again within the hospital, so research administration officers or the pharmacy department also said, well, we'd like to be able to access and gain information to this information. So more tighter integration between what our research nursing staff are doing or our researchers are doing and the rest of the hospital environment. So the EDGE program grew organically from the requirements of its user community. So as we started to dig further into looking at who else was involved in the process of running trials, it became evident that the pathology department, as I said, the pharmacy, various different investigators, research officers, all were becoming more and more interested in what we were doing and how many trials we were running. But we also found that there was a plethora of duplication in effort and data in silos appearing throughout the system. And this process is also very similar in the electronic healthcare record, that we see specialist I guess, software for, say, specifically, say, in oncology, for instance, or specific disease areas, but the information flow wasn't necessarily flowing around, and which ones were the single source of truth was becoming more and more confused. And when we looked at this from a clinical research project, and this just being one site involved in our clinical research projects, and then we escalated that to the large numbers of sites who are involved in undertaking clinical trials or a particular clinical trial for one particular project, or in EHR terms for one care process, we would see a patient or a project was being duplicated in a vast number of different systems, and we felt that this was extremely inefficient, and that actually it was very difficult to identify what we were talking about in terminology. So one organization would report something, but although it sounded as though we were talking about the same thing, it became very apparent that we weren't talking about the same thing. So we moved in the last 5 to 6 years ago to a global system operating as software as a service. So we have a single database now, which has a large number of different organizations as tenants of that software, who are basically collaborating and joining a collaboration around each individual research project that's being undertaken nationally. So each sponsor of a particular clinical trial sets up a research project in the system and make that globally visible to the other hospitals or community hospitals or primary care practices that are involved in that project. And these projects then agree to collaborate around that single project and share the information in real time between them. So this diagram representing a kind of a single record of truth in relation to the project, and then the information from each of the sites flowing up into that central record with certain sort of security processes in place to keep anonymized information about patients away from other trusts or teams, but to aggregate data together so that we can see a portfolio of research that we're running at either at a regional level or a national level or even at a global level for those individual research studies, looking at information about the time it takes for research patients to be enrolled into these studies and to identify where there has been huge delays in setting up and running these clinical trials. So at the moment we are now structured something like this. These numbers are actually just slightly out of date, but we have around about 80% of the NHS now using EDGE as a single system for research management. We have around about 70,000 listed users on the system, but around about 900 unique users a day, with an increase of 600 in the last year in terms of unique users a day. We're managing around about 50,000 research projects across the NHS, and the number of 1.5 million patient records being managed in EDGE is actually now about 2.5 million patient records. So an enormous amount of work and effort being put into the system. 32,000 users, as I said, now 70, 500,000 documents. But the structure of the way we've also built the system is to create contributing new ideas. So we have structure by where we're gathering requirements from users within each of our host organizations that are using Edge, so that the entire application and its development is driven by a user community. That user community actually is now 465 people. But this has helped resolve a number of issues, which hopefully we'll go on to talk about, which is around the development of software and standards and terminology, which we found when combining large numbers of users into a single system highlighted the issues and the importance of interoperability between systems, as there was a non-clarity about what we were actually talking about, from very, very simple medical concepts all the way through to much more complex concepts. And in fact, even organizationally, what an organization did or what an organization was supposed to do was hugely confused in the system. So just to talk a little bit about our user community. So our user community has been built on a number of different elements to create an ecosystem whereby we can actually adopt standards and terminology to try and move away from these silos of information and to ensure that we're all talking about the same thing and working from the same page in clinical research. So first was a cultural one of cultural change in large organizations, and the adoption of standards in particular. Even in the NHS, we struggle very much with integration and cultural change within our organizations about adopting new technology or approaches. Because when we work in isolation, there was no impetus for us to actually change. We were only really worried about ourselves. But when we brought the challenges that were being held nationally or internationally about clinical trials, the way to adopt or solve those problems was by standardized approaches. But adopting those standardized approaches, when we talk about that at a very high level, is very difficult at the coalface where the work's being done to be appreciated. So culturally, we needed to change people's views about sharing information around particular projects or patients. We had to change the culture of we needed to work collaboratively with one another, and we also had to build, I guess, a structure of cultural change, not just within our own institutions, but to work collaboratively with multiple other organizations, because we weren't very good at sharing of this information or best practice in particular. We really needed to take an approach of building an innovative community, whereby we recognized that in certain hospitals or certain groups they had innovative ideas about how to affect change or processes or procedures or technology or training that we needed to share. Again, the NHS is not very good at sharing stuff, so we wanted to build an innovative program whereby people would be happy and keen to try and share that innovation. We needed to create a sort of feeling of wow amongst our users, to show that the value of participating and joining our club and sharing information would be of benefit to them, both individually or to them as an organization. And so we had to create some sort of additional functionality to add value to what they were doing and to show leadership. And this real sense of community. It's not just about our computer systems or our software or our terminology, but really to invest in our community of people and to invest into areas where there was good practice, or to pump prime additional funding into those groups to continue working on the individual ideas they had, which we could then share with everybody else. So not just about a community of software or community of technology, but a community of people which we needed to bring together using technology and virtual technology, but also physically together to share their experience. And from an actual piece of software perspective, we needed to really use and adopt standards. As I said, the terminology that was being used across the NHS was not uniform in some terms and approaches. The way we described structures was not standardized, and we weren't actually applying any core internationally recognized standards. So we needed to start embedding those standards into the software that we were building. We needed to look at the interface, which had been very organizationally, operationally focused rather than clinically focused. So we needed to change the minds of clinical staff that it was quicker to write something down on a piece of paper rather than doing it in a piece of software. And so we needed to really look at how we presented the user interface to those clinical staff to make it clinically relevant so that they would adopt it. And the interfaces technically, how can we streamline the process of pulling data from other clinical systems so that we could move towards a principle of enter once and not repeat. So predominantly around national systems in the NHS. This was around, we have, for instance, a national ethics system, we had a national portfolio of research. Why were we retyping stuff in? How can we pull that data in so that we can harmonize that data? And also looking at how, for instance, we could put interfaces into our EHR so that we could pull clinical data or demographic data from different clinical systems into the research environment. So we've been really working towards a continuous development of our software and our systems, services, integrations, community, as well as our standards that we're developing that are constant development. So we are not just building something and walking away from it, we're continuously developing it. So the EDGE program has around about 5 to 6 releases every year where we're continuing adding more and more clinical as well as back-end information or services, terminology or interoperability into other systems to continue that development. So it's always seen as version 1, then there's 2, then there's 3, and it's a continuous development process. Ultimately, we're trying to architect a structure for clinical research, which is really moving towards preparing us for the future and to try and get ourselves away from being specifically tied essentially to one piece of software. And architecture, as we know, is about some building blocks to help us build a better future in terms of our computer systems, which have been, as I said earlier, very siloed to that process. So to take that analogy, we've had several blocks that we've been adding to over a period of time to try and create better care models in the NHS so that we can look towards more integrated platforms. So these individual blocks that we've been creating in the NHS actually need to start looking like one integrated system rather than fragmented numbers of subsystems underneath that. And really moving towards a sort of open plan or patient-centric care environment where it's easy to flow around the system. The NHS is perceived as one single system, but is actually made up of 475 different actual legal entities as hospitals, and sharing that information is extremely difficult. And although we can create say an integrated platform or an integrated healthcare record or an integrated research record within one environment, such as some of these extremely fancy hospitals, patients actually move through the health system and they don't specifically stay within one logical physical environment, geographical environment, or one care environment. And so we need to be able to talk about the transportability of information between EHRs as well as research systems, which is again cost time and money in terms of integration and interoperability within the NHS. So an integrated informatics platform for research we've identified here as being made up of a number of different elements. There's our electronic patient record development teams within our hospitals who are working on clinical systems and extraction of data from those electronic healthcare records. Clinical informatics research teams working on big data, so more integrated research across different health platforms through our HES data nationally, which is collating high-level episode data for all patients within the NHS, but also looking at the extraction of clinical data into clinical data management systems for research purposes. and then we're looking at the movement here with the 100,000 genome project, where we're sequencing around about 70,000 NHS patients to look at the development of the clinical exome or target or stratified medicine, and then finally the bioinformatics requirements on top of that for further developing pipelines and constructing tools necessary to expand further our discovery of more genomic-specific biomarkers or what else it might be we're looking at from a kind of molecular perspective. So we've recognized that we have to try and join these things up together slightly better. So most of us are fully aware of the interoperability in care and research, and certainly the key messages from the UK is that we are driven predominantly by commercial software, which tends not to be it forever as costs or new technology arriving, but standards are likely to be around forever and are continually developing. And we've also looked at our development of academic software in history, whereby academic organizations have developed software to be used in infrastructures, and they've been designed and again have been either bespoke to specific institutions or specific requirements, which again have been here for some time and then again have disappeared. There are examples from Manchester and Oxford and various other places where they've developed software and then that team has disappeared, and so the software disappears. But if they had applied certain types of standards to that, then we could have possibly worked to move that data around, where we've suffered this now here in the UK numerous occasions. So we're really looking at, from my group's perspective, the adoption of the CDISC standards and the ODM file structures for data transportability within clinical research. But ironically, the CDISC standards are critical actually in some respects to our electronic healthcare records, as there is a belief that we need to integrate more tightly clinical research to our electronic healthcare record systems. Here in the NHS, most of our electronic healthcare record systems do not have any standards based in either the way the data is held or how an individual patient's file is structured, or even within the same hospital about standardized terminology for describing disease. So one system may be using SNOMED, one may be using SNOMED CT, and others may be using ICD-10. And we don't have a consistent approach to how we're storing the data within the electronic healthcare record. In clinical trials, we have been adopting CDISC standards as a structure to hold the CRF document, which is the case report form for collecting the clinical data for those patients participating on a trial. That ODM file structure allowing us to be able to describe multiple clinical events or laboratory events or administrative events in a structure which can be passed or consumed between different clinical data management systems as part of the trial structure. And so we're beginning to explore how we may be able to further expand and use CDISC more clinically here in Southampton and in a wider Wessex region, so that we can transport the file structures around in and out of clinical research, so that we can pull data for clinical research processes directly from the EHR. So a couple of points really. The therapeutic area development within CDISC has been increased and ramped up over the last couple of years, which is adding value in terms of not needing to repeat the development of certain types of data sets that we're using over and over again within clinical trials. And again, we're believing that these therapeutic areas may be relevant to the development of other clinical systems where the work has already been undertaken by CDISC. And we're using and adopting more and more CDISC share and those standards, and are hoping to mobilize some of these standards into a terminology server, which we'll be sharing between the University of Cologne and the University of Southampton, but then making it available to a wider audience of anyone who wants to contribute to a terminology service based in a cloud, where we can add in various different terminologies, both from CDISC, but other areas such as ICD-10 or WHO drug or MEDRA, and try and get some harmonization and some actual practical IT services that can be used, where at the moment we are struggling to find robust terminology services across research areas. So just to hold a little bit on the CDISC therapeutic areas, I've just put together a quick overview of some of the therapeutic areas that are being developed and are at least in either version 1 or version 3 in some cases, and the continuation of these development of is being undertaken by more and more groups. So at the moment, CDISC is predominantly, its membership is drawn from the pharmaceutical industry and CROs, but we're beginning to see an uptake more and more of hospital organizations or academic institutions joining CDISC, in particular in Asia and Japan specifically, to help develop further these therapeutic areas, which are not only fit for purpose for clinical trials, but would also be fit for purpose to be used within the clinical setting. So some of these may have relevance to some of you, and if you've not seen the therapeutic areas within CDISC, I strongly recommend using them. A huge amount of, I guess, resource and effort has been put into developing these, and a large amount of structured clinical information is described in the therapeutic area standards. So how are we better focusing for the future? Certainly research is changing a lot. Software needs to integrate more into the electronic health record. We're talking about having trials of one patient potentially, specifically with the genomic medicine revolution that's happening in the UK. But even if it's not genetic specific type of trial, more and more the efficiencies of having patients participating in trials and the value both for the patient and economically are driving the fact that studies with hundreds of thousands of patients need to integrate into the electronic healthcare record, and that trials are ultimately global. And it's really important that we look at how we get tighter integration between the electronic health record and the standards and interoperability within our healthcare environments, and how they fit with our research agendas or clinical trials normally within the same physical locations, which have very much been working in isolation. So we need to really look about that integration more and more, and how do we go about doing that. We're also looking at predominantly the issues around on-premise installations of software. We found that by implementing cloud-based technology and software as a service models in clinical research and in some aspects of the electronic healthcare record, there can be savings both in time, money and paperwork and validation for clinical trials by around about 75%, which is a large, certainly in cost terms, 75% savings on software hosting is a big driver for us moving towards using more and more cloud-based technologies within the UK and the NHS, and also the technology changes that are occurring. Browser development is continuous, as is the development of APIs in the world outside of healthcare and research. And as an example, in the NHS, we've only just lost Internet Explorer 6 within the last 3 months. And in Canada, where we work as well, and Edge is being deployed at the moment, we see between 60 and 70% of Internet Explorer 7 and 8, which is hampering some of our technology development. So certainly we see lots of exciting new software in clinical research being developed by the pharmaceutical industry, and we see a lot of exciting new software being developed in the electronic healthcare record environment, but in terms of research, we still see that pharmaceutical organizations are having to ship out laptops to individual nurses to be able to undertake data capture rather than using existing infrastructure within the hospital. So as hospitals, we realize we do need to actually keep up with the technology that's occurring outside of the health service and try and move forward that. And some of my colleagues, both in the pharmaceutical industry and in academia, still don't realize the technology challenges that we have in the UK. Now, part of this is around the fact that the NHS is somewhat hampered by itself and its enormous bureaucratic processes. So we have a distinct lack of agility within the NHS to be able to adopt new technology and standards. What we're seeing is that there is a great technology revolution happening elsewhere in the world where these existing burdening structures don't exist, and there is much more freedom to be innovative and use technology in a very different and exciting way. So at the moment, a large number of us here in the NHS are looking towards the open source electronic health record as an exciting opportunity. We're looking at examples for how technology is being utilized, for instance, in clinical trials in Africa using mobile phone technology or using mobile-based applications, which again we have not seen a huge amount of uptake here in the NHS, and trying to see how we can actually steal ideas from other areas of the world to try and realize that potential. So our plan here at the moment is looking at some structures that look like this in our own area, again heavily based upon standards both in technology and standards within our platforms and trying to move towards cloud-based technology. So we're using Microsoft Azure at the moment to start to work through some of those savings and interoperability, looking at security and regulation of data held within Microsoft Azure and using some of the tools to ensure that we can secure and meet the regulatory requirements that we have in the NHS. And then looking to build health platforms as a service to be able to encourage the sharing of common software, common terminology and common applications, and allowing us to basically iterate innovative applications where someone can develop an application in one hospital, but at the moment we have a great difficulty in sharing that or implementing that piece of technology or software in another hospital. So, and this is mainly around things like common data sets or different technologies. So we're looking to try and build an innovative application, I guess, platform, which means we can quicker share that development done by somebody else. We're trying at the moment to move towards much more clinically centric software. As I said earlier, the NHS's electronic healthcare record systems have been predominantly based on billing and organizational management rather than specifically patient care or patient management. So we need to make much more use of the maps of patient care that we've been developing here in the UK and specifically in this hospital where we've been leading on the development of patient pathways in the map of medicine, and how this can be pulled together to take that clinically phenotypic data to mix with the big data issues that we're having around personalized medicine and the use of the human genome in our big data programs and the developmental research that we're doing within our university environment, and looking at overall reducing the compute costs to take budgets from away from buying hardware to put them into cloud environments, both either public or private clouds, to allow us to reinvest into our electronic healthcare records. So really trying to look towards much more patient-centric care and mixing the traditional care that we've seen historically, gaining greater clinical detail in our electronic healthcare records and tying that much more tightly to our personalized medicine programs. So that was an overview from what we've been doing in terms of clinical research, and I'd be very happy to take some questions, but if there are any, in fact, but I'd equally be very happy to spend the time to actually just show the application if people would be interested in specifically seeing the application and seeing whether there is anything that may be of value in terms of stealing as ideas from that process. But I'm open to questions first.
Right, thank you for that very informative lecture, Professor James. We have some questions from our attendees. The first one is from Dr. Alvin Marcelo, Executive Director of the Asia eHealth Information Network. He's asking, how big was the first group? He also said that amazing work organizing the community of researchers.
So the question again was, sorry, how big was?
The first group.
The first group. So the first group that we put together was our own local region, which was 14 hospitals. And in our 14 hospitals, we assumed as academics naively that the hospital would know how many research we were running, but we found very quickly as nobody, well, they did know, but it was all held within filing cabinets, and we were politely asked to go and start counting paper files. So 14 hospitals was the original grouping. Now 80% of the NHS, the whole of Scotland, the whole of Wales, the whole of Northern Ireland. We're also implementing across the Cancer Research Network in Canada, and provincially all of research in the province of Alberta in Canada. And we're also exploring implementing EDGE in Belgium at the moment, and also the Netherlands, so that we have all these people collaborating around these research projects in one piece of software.
All right, thank you, Professor James. Here is another question. This one is from Dr. Bunchai of Thailand, Asia eHealth Information Network chair. The question is, could you explain more about ICD-10, WHO drug, and the difference of NHS DM plus D?
So there is a big difference between this. So in the NHS, in a vain attempt to try and standardize things, we have something called the NHS Data Dictionary, which is available for anyone to go and look at. You can just search NHS Data Dictionary. And in the NHS, we tried to standardize some of our coding systems across the NHS. However, implementing that has been very difficult. The NHS has also been very good at dreaming up its own standards rather than adopting international standards. So ICD-10, from that perspective, is being reasonably well adopted as the International Disease Classification version 10 into the NHS, specifically in oncology. However, in other areas of the NHS, ICD-10 has not been adopted very well, and we've been using specific coding lists from the Royal College of Surgeons or the Royal College of Physicians or other specialty groups. We've also found that with ICD-10, there are big differences between ICD-10, say, and MESH as a coding system, which is again used for disease classification in medical research, or say MEDRA, which is used predominantly by the pharmaceutical industry for coding certain clinical outcomes or activities, or versus SNOMED CT. So we've actually identified that there's a group in a university working on something called the disease ontology, which is trying to bring together all of these different coding systems and make maps and align them. Again, in ICD-10, we see that there is good molecular descriptions of disease, say, for instance, in hematological oncologies, but not so much in other areas. We've also identified in ICD-10 there isn't enough detail when it comes to genomic type diseases. So both in the NHS and in Germany in particular, we've taken ICD-10 and sort of pimped it by adding additional structures into it to meet our own kind of clinical or organizational management needs. In terms of the WHO drug, the pharmaceutical industry in particular uses the World Health Organization drug dictionary from the Uppsala monitoring in Sweden, but it is extremely expensive to use and adopt, and if you're a pharmaceutical company, you'll pay the heavy cost to adopting that specific terminology and coding. In academia and healthcare, it's been prohibitively expensive, although we are trying to persuade Uppsala that they should change their licensing model to gain more adoption, because that would be of more benefit than no adoption of their software or their coding systems. In the NHS, we have our own localized version, which is based upon the National Drug Formulary and the associated drugs that have been approved by NICE, which is predominantly being adopted and implemented into our pharmacy systems. So the M is fine for clinical care within the NHS, and it's perfectly fit for purpose. The problem is that in translating it from a clinical setting into a clinical trial setting, where ultimately the data needs to pass from an academic institution to probably a number of pharmaceutical clinical trials, we have to use data encoding methods that are accepted by the FDA or EMA, and they obviously prefer to use MedDRA, for instance, and the WHO Drug Dictionary.
All right, thank you, Professor James. Here is another question. This one is from Dr. Sambas of Cambodia. Do all sites use cloud-based database systems?
So can you ask the question again?
Do all sites use cloud-based database systems?
I think I probably slightly, I'm just trying to see, is the question actually written?
Yes, it's written on the Q&A panel.
So yes, all sites do use a cloud-based data system. So there is one single implementation of the software, and that lives actually lives in a private cloud at the moment. But that cloud is centrally hosted and has a number of security requirements applied to it. And all of the hospitals then have a tenancy for their own hospital set up in the system. So a hospital says we'd like to join the program because we want to share data and we want to work more efficiently. We create that hospital as a tenant within the software as a service model, and they are basically inputting their patient identifiable information and their project information into that cloud-based system. The only bit they're sharing is the high-level project information. The patient identifiable information doesn't actually get shared with anyone outside of that clinical or hospital setting.
Yes, thank you. Here is another question from Dr. Sambal. Please explain on the importance of interoperability and integrated platforms.
So for us, the real importance about interoperability and an integrated platform is that although I may be Pfizer, or I may be, GlaxoSmithKline or something like that, I'm living in my pharmaceutical office somewhere. We have to actually go and run these projects at a hospital site, and what's really important, or what we found, was that if I'm the chief investigator and I persuaded 10 sites to participate in this trial, 10 investigators go back to 10 hospitals and they basically go and create 10 records of the same thing. Now, partly the software itself resolves some of that interoperability issue because it is a single record for that research project. However, a research project is a longitudinal record from I woke up in a cold sweat with a bright idea through to I need to publish this at the very end, and the information that we're about the project and the patients has to go off to other systems, so ethics systems, for instance, or funding systems to apply for a grant, or the data may need to be exported and sent to, say, lab data might need to be exported and sent to an electronic data management system, and by not having this interoperability in terms of being able to electronically send that in some shape or form, or integrating it so this data immediately moves from one system to another, there's been a major delay either in setting up and running clinical trials and thus reporting the result of that trial as quickly as possible, which ultimately speeds it towards being adopted or licensed as a drug. But it also creates errors in the data, and we spend a lot of time and money and effort in correcting those errors. And also the key thing is about when we come to running a clinical trial, we have a protocol which describes the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the patients. And if we know that that protocol, for instance, which is normally a written document, has an associated, I guess, machine-readable document, and I don't mean by using machine learning to read that document, but much more coded information, say, for instance, like the ICD-10 code of the disease we're trying to particularly treat with this protocol, then we can extract that data out of, say, EDGE, and we can connect that to an EHR, and as patients are diagnosed with a particular condition, then that EHR or that pathology system or that lab system could immediately identify that this patient could be eligible to participate in a clinical trial. And so the more we can give patients access to research projects, even if they're not interventional, just observational research is just as important, or population health monitoring. The more tightly we can integrate that, the flow of the data moves around quicker, the better we have an understanding, and the quicker we may be able to intervene or change practice.
All right, here's another question, Professor James. This one is from Dr. Ted Herbosa of the Philippines. He's asking, how do I collaborate in traumatic brain injury, for example?
That's a good question. So there's a number of bits to consider there. In terms of a specific research project or a specific research question, for instance, or collaborating about an individual patient, there's a number of ways I think that we would go about looking at collaborating. One is using the multidisciplinary team approach, which not only do we use in terms of care, but we also use in terms of research. So embedded in specifically in our multidisciplinary teams from a care perspective, there is a research nurse who is responsible for ensuring whether there may be an opportunity for those patients to participate in trials. Traumatic brain injury, of course, is a difficult area to research for a number of reasons. Normally, as these patients are coming in and they're critically unwell, and normally there are very quick decisions that need to be made about what to do with these patients from a standard care perspective, let alone in trying to enroll them or embroil them into a clinical trial. And also the small issues in relation to whether they can or can't consent, and or who else may consent for them in those particular scenarios. So here in the UK, we do have a specific trauma research theme, specifically in traumatic brain injury, where there are protocols in place, in particular in this hospital is a neurological trauma centre, whereby patients are recruited and randomized into processes or into trials as soon as they enter the trauma setting, normally in close consultation with any family or relatives, and also looking at whether the research project has a very specific benefit to that patient, either from an interventional perspective or in an outcomes measure perspective. Certainly, again, we're seeing in the value in terms of EDGE bringing large numbers of researchers together. So out of our 70,000 listed users on EDGE, about 70%, ironically saying number, but about 70% of them are clinical, and it's also about getting clinicians to be able to work much more collaboratively, both in the design of studies, but also creating much more visibility to a broader trial portfolio, so that investigators can opt to participate in studies because they're made more aware of them earlier, rather than it being more of a word of mouth or waiting for specific clinical meetings to expose this particular trial's availability to participate in. So I think how to collaborate in a traumatic brain injury, for instance, there are a number of elements about collaborating both at the clinical level, the opportunity to participate in trials, the collaboration between the clinical teams, again with the importance of ensuring that clinical trials are represented in that process. So there's a number of different ways, I think. But certainly traumatic brain injury trials here in the UK are is a strong topic area where there's been, a lot of work to try and resolve some of those problems.
Professor James?
Yes.
This is Alvin.
Hi.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting topic. And we do have a lot of questions, but we're running out of time.
Of course.
Is it okay that we send them by email and share it with your answer with the participants by email?
Yes, of course. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that people have got and to and pass those back for you. Yes, that would be very happy to do that.
And before we end the session, we're really, really very interested to tap onto the EDGE network. Is it something we need to do first within our own countries, or can we go straight from our respective institutions and go straight to EDGE, or is EDGE really just for the UK? Over.
So to answer that question very briefly, we do see EDGE as being something that is accessible to lots of people. We tend to show, when we actually even show the actual, real software, as it were, to people, then people become very interested in it. Our view is either steal the ideas and duplicate it yourself, or join the EDGE program. We're not particularly fussed either way, and we're always very happy to hear from individual hospitals or larger groups about joining the program. So we'd be very happy to explain that further if individuals wanted to look at that specifically.
That's great to hear. Dr. Teodoro Herbosa, who's on the line, is actually a former Undersecretary of Health and is my co-faculty member at the University of the Philippines College of Medicine.
Yeah.
We were chatting offline, and we have an open grant for the Newton Fund, and we were looking for collaborators in the UK. So we can carry this offline and maybe find a way to get an EDGE instance over here in the Philippines or maybe Southeast Asia. One final question is, the choice of Microsoft technologies, was that by design or serendipitous or both, or a hybrid? Over.
So the reasons why we use Microsoft technology is a number of reasons. In the NHS, it's predominantly been around the fact that I don't think we historically have thought about open source as being very safe in the NHS, which I think, historically we were always very worried about, would it break? And so we've always taken the adoption of Microsoft technology, in our hospitals, and what programs we're using for typing on and stuff, because there was always the option to ring someone up and shout at them to come and mend it, if that makes sense. And the fact that we had a reasonably large workforce of people wandering around knowing how Microsoft products work. I think from a technology perspective, the world's kind of changed slightly. Edge has always been browser independent. You can operate it on, Internet Explorer, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, work on anything, and there's no client installation, so it doesn't matter whether you are using Linux or whether you're using Windows. From a back-end perspective, the reason why we chose Microsoft Azure potentially for a number of projects that we're working on, and ultimately maybe where even Edge lands, is that although there is Google and Amazon Cloud and things like that, they couldn't very specifically tie data to a particular geographical location, whereas Microsoft was able to say, when you get to the point of hitting save patient, we could be very specific that it was saving the data within the European Union, or in Canada they wanted to be specifically on, on Canadian territory. And so Microsoft Azure has, for instance, even in Asia, the data centers where, specifically you can tie that data to landing in one space, whereas the other two were not able really to be able to do that.
Wow. I learned something new today about Azure. Great. So we'll
Hello.
Dr. Bunchai, our chair. Go ahead, Dr. Bunchai.
Hello, Professor James. This is Bunchai.
Hi, Bunchai.
Yeah. Thank you for having webinar for our network, and I think we should have more. If you have something to share, over.
Yes, I think I'd be very happy to share. And Vijay, as you know, I was planning on attending the meeting later this year when the network comes together in Myanmar, and I'm really hoping and looking forward to being able to attend that. And that may be an opportunity either to talk more, either formally or with people within the network, in lunch breaks or outside of the meeting, so that there's an opportunity to expand more dialogue and collaboration with other people within your network.
Okay. Actually, we maybe have to postpone the conference to around February to March, and we are that is for your information. But certainly we will invite you to join our meeting. But to give you an head up that we might most possibly to move our general meeting to the end of February to March. Over.
Yes, I'd be very interested just to keep in touch about what's happening and opportunities to meet people wherever and whenever. So, yeah, that would be good to keep in touch.
And we can use the interim period between now and the GM in February or March to generate a core group at AIN, maybe from 2 to 3 or maybe more countries, so that by the time you get to Myanmar, we can hit the ground running, maybe really start exchanging practical aspects like how to generate our own Azure instances with our Edge systems. Yeah. So we have a member, Dr. Jai Ganesh. Mr. Jai Ganesh is the one focused on research, and also Professor Pradeep Ray. I don't know if you know Pradeep. He's from University of New South Wales in Australia. So we have a core group on research, and I think we can add you in that core group and get some things going on so that we can achieve a lot when when you join us in Myanmar this February.
Great. That's
perfect. So, Dr. Bunchai, as our tradition, if our chair is joining the webinar, our chair gets the final say to say goodbye. Dr. Bunchai, back to you.
Okay, thank you everyone. I think this is very informative and very useful for our network. Thank you, Professor James, and good night to everyone. So the meeting adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and good night to everyone. Good night from Myanmar. Thank you, Professor James. We'll get in touch.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.